Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be making 5 cards with the September 2021 card kit by Simon Says Stamp, which is chock full of lots of stuff. So I'm going to start off with my first card here. I'm cutting down a piece of the pattern paper to an A2 size, and actually it's a little bit smaller than an A2 size. And I'm going to use one of the large floral images from just one of the stamp sets because this kit comes with 2 large stamp sets. And I'm going to stamp this out twice with blackout ink by Ink on 3. We're obviously going to be doing some Copic coloring, and because it's pattern paper, it can be a little hard to see the lines, so I did stamp it twice. Now I'm going to color directly over or on top of my pattern paper. Now, if you're using alcohol markers for this, you will be able to see the pattern underneath. I'm not going to show you all of the coloring. I'm just going to kind of show you some of the color combinations that I used and where I did my shading, but I'm going to skip through a lot of this just because it gets a little repetitive. But alcohol markers are transparent. They're not opaque at all. So I am going to be able to see the design through my coloring, which I'm okay with. That's exactly the look I'm going for. Throughout the darker areas, like with my scary dark colors, you're not necessarily going to see it too well, but it can get a little confusing. So as you're doing your coloring, I would recommend either stamping the image on a scrap piece of paper or use the packaging of the stamp itself in case you have to reference that image to see exactly what you're coloring. But if you can't tell what something is because of the pattern, the recipient of the card isn't going to be able to tell either. So if you accidentally color something that's not supposed to be a leaf and you colored it like a leaf, odds are whoever's receiving the card is not going to know either. So I colored some of the leaves, or I colored as many leaves as I could see right now. I did end up having to go back and I found a few more later, and I'm going to move on to the one flower here. And you'll notice that I'm going right in with my darkest color. This paper is not necessarily made for alcohol marker coloring, so I don't want to oversaturate it because then your colors can bleed outside the lines, and I want to avoid that. So in order to avoid that, I'm putting minimal ink on the paper. So starting off with the darkest color and just very lightly blending that out with my mid-tone and my lightest color will avoid oversaturating the paper. I do have to say though, I've colored on pattern paper a lot. In fact, I love the results that I get from it. But this particular paper that comes in this kit is nice and smooth. It's sturdy and it took the ink really well. So if you wanted to kind of layer up the colors even more than I did, you probably would be pretty safe in doing that on this particular paper that comes in the kit. So I colored the other flower, the same way as far as the petals go. Now for the centers of these, I don't want it to stand, I don't want to get too dark with it because the pattern paper is really bright and colorful. So I don't want to go too dark and put like too many browns in there. So I just toned it down just a little bit by using an E marker and a YR marker, and it's kind of like a golden color. It's very similar to the flower itself, but it still stands out just enough. Now for these other flowers here, I'm going to bring in some pinks. I'm trying to go with the colors that are actually in the pattern paper to kind of bring them out a little bit. And once again, I am starting off with my darkest color. Now these flowers are the flowers themselves aren't small, but the petals are very small. So I'm pretty much just outlining it. And you can't see it on camera, but I do have the packaging from the stamp off to the side, and you'll see that I pause every couple of seconds, and that's just because I am looking at that image to know exactly what I'm doing, where my petals are and where they begin and what is part of what flower. So for this one, I used the R83 as my lightest color. Didn't get quite as much contrast as I'd like to. So for the other 2 flowers, which I'm not going to bother to show you, I used the R81 as my lightest instead. So finished up the coloring for that, and I'm going to go ahead and take some of the doll pink cardstock that comes in the kit, and cut that just a little bit larger than my card panel, but it's still just a tad bit smaller than a card base itself. That way I have a nice border around my image, but still a border around that as well. It just makes everything kind of pop a little bit for a simple card like this. Using my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere everything together. Now the kit does come with a glue stick by Simon Says Stamp. I think it's a new product, which I will bring out later. I just totally forgot about it for this one. So for my sentiment, I had to take a little bit of a break because I had a visitor. This is Frankie for those of you who are new to the channel, but for those of you who have been around a while, you're very familiar with Frankie. He loves to watch me color. So I'm going to stamp out this sentiment on the Doll Pink cardstock with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a black pigment ink. It gives a nice crisp image. And then I'm just going to fussy cut that. You can use your paper trimmer for this because it is straight lines, but I found it easier just to cut it with my scissors. And you can see that I'm just leaving a little bit of a border so that that Doll Pink paper shows through. This is the same paper that I use as my border or my mat, whatever you want to call it. So that will make everything kind of come together. So once I have all of that cut out, I'm just using a bunch of these little foam dots here and popping that up right in the center towards the top of the card. And that is it for this. Well, no, actually, I tried to add a little bit of a shimmer, but I had to cut that out because Frankie decided he did not have enough of the card making for today, so he hopped back up on the desk. But I added shimmer with a wink of Stella pen to just the flower area. So on to the second card. This is probably the easiest card I've ever made, and I actually love the way it turned out. I'm going to use some of the decorative tape. It's basically washi tape from Tim Holtz. This comes in the kit. You can see that you get lots of rolls here. I'm just going to pick out 2 of them. I'm using a piece of Desert Storm cardstock. This is just from my stash. You can use any cardstock here. And if you've never seen one of my kit videos, you'll notice that I bring in very few materials from outside of the kit. It's basically just your basics that most people have in their craft room, but I try to keep to the kit just in case you're just starting out and you don't have a lot of supplies outside of the kit. Kits are a great way to kind of build your stash up a little bit. So I try just to use what's in the kit. So I'm going to layer my washi tape here, 2 different kinds, one on the top, one on the bottom, really. But I'm just leaving a little bit of a space between the regular washi tape, I guess you could call it regular washi tape, and kind of like the sparkly kind. And I'm just eyeballing it. The first time I measured it, you don't need to do that. You can just eyeball it. They're straight lines. It's pretty simple. Now, I just folded the excess over the back of the cardstock. You're not going to see it, and it's thin enough where it's not going to add any bulk to your card. Now, I should have done this first before I added the tape, but I ended up trimming this down just a little bit, but I made sure that I took the same amount from the top as I did the bottom, just so that I have an even amount of that tape showing. I also cut a piece of black cardstock, again, just slightly larger than the card panel, but slightly smaller than the card base itself. Now, I am going to bring out this glue stick that comes in the kit, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. I've been using the Tombow Mono Multi Glue for many years, and I'm just so used to it that I don't like change. I'm not good with change. So I think that might be my issue, but it stuck. The corners started to lift just a little bit, but I just think that it needs a little bit longer to sit than the Tombow Mono Multi Glue. So I just put this under my Misty just to let the glue set a little bit so that my corners weren't lifting while I work on my sentiment. And really it only took about a minute or so and I was good to go. So for my sentiment, I'm using one of these sentiment strips also from the kit. I'm going to bring out another piece of the Desert Storm and another piece of the black cardstock, and I'm going to create a mat just so there's not too much blank space on my card. This is a very simple card. Like I said, it's so simple. You can mass produce these pretty easily. So I'm just going to stick this sentiment strip onto the Desert Storm. I'm going to cut this down just so that a little bit of the Desert Storm shows through on all 4 sides. I ended up bringing out my mini tonic trimmer, which is my go-to for any sentiment strips. I love this trimmer. I couldn't live without this trimmer. It just is so easy to use, and it's so precise to get those really fine or tiny little sentiment strips. So I'm going to also glue this on to the black cardstock as well. And I'm basically going to do the same thing. So I'm going to have the sentiment strip, a little bit of a border of the Desert Storm to match my card, and a little bit of the black to match my sentiment and the matte for my card base, or for my card panel itself. I hope that makes sense, but you guys know what I mean. So once again, I'm going to trim that down, and then I'm going to stick that right down in the center. I didn't pop this up with foam tape because it already has quite a bit of dimension anyway. I'm going to finish off with the Perfect Pearls that come in the kit as well. Now, they must have changed their formula because this is an old school product. I had Perfect Pearls a long time ago, and they never really settled down to like a bead. It was always kind of pointy, and these settled down nicely. I just tapped it on my work surface a few times, and I was good to go. So for the third card, I'm going to use a piece of watercolor paper. This is Canson watercolor paper, and I'm taking this gigantic image that I'm also going to color with my colored pencils for this Friday's video. Every Friday, if you guys don't know, I know this is weird. I know this sounds weird, but I do cold cases and coloring. So I'll just color an image. Not going to really talk you through the coloring, but I talk about a missing person case, typically a missing person's case. And it's kind of just something to listen to while you watch the coloring, and I'm a huge true crime junkie, and I don't know, missing person cases just get to me because the family just never has any answers. So anyway, I am stamping this a total of 3 times with my Blackout ink by Ink on 3, and I'm going to be doing some messy watercolor. And the ink on 3, the Blackout ink is Copic safe, but it's also waterproof, so you can use that for watercolor as well. I'm using my Arteza watercolor pan here, and I'm not going to be doing very good watercoloring. I'm not great at it anyway. I'd love to do this image with watercolor, like really try, but this is just a quick card. These are all very quick cards. So I'm taking some clean water, and I'm just going to go over the petals of this flower. Then I'm going to dip my brush into that yellow paint, and I'm just going to plop it on. I'm not being careful. I'm going outside of the lines, sort of kind of on purpose, but I'm just not trying to stay in the lines. I want this to look really messy. Going to go on to the next one and do the same thing. Lay out my clear water and then go in with my pigment and just drop it in. Now, if it doesn't spread the way you want it to, just kind of use your brush to kind of force it to. And you can do multiple layers of this. Remember that watercolor, any watercolor medium, well, most watercolor mediums, I should say, do dry back. So meaning that as they dry, they get lighter. So if you want this to be brighter or darker, you can do multiple layers of this. I didn't. I wanted to kind of keep it pastel, kind of, sort of. But I also wanted to look messy. So I was in a messy mood. So I continued around with the petals, and the good thing about another good thing about messy watercolor is not only do you not have to be good at watercolor, you don't have to wait for everything to dry first. As long as you're using colors that are not going to make mud, which I'm not, I don't have to wait for everything to completely dry before moving on to the next step. So I'm going to do the same thing with the leaves. I'm going to obviously use green for the leaves, which blends beautifully with yellows. It doesn't matter if they mix. It's just going to make a lighter green, and I'm not going to make any mud. So I don't have to wait for those petals to dry. I did end up using 2 different greens just because I felt like it needed a little bit of variation in color, but that's not even necessary. You kind of just drop it in and let it do its thing. Now, for the centers of the flowers, however, this is where I probably should have waited a little bit of time for this to dry because I added so much water that it did take a little bit of time to dry. I went right in and added my color to the middle, which I probably shouldn't have done because it did bleed a little. Well, it didn't bleed a little. It bled right out into the petals. So I just quickly took, not even that quickly, you don't have to be that quick, took a paper towel and just dabbed it up, straight down, straight up with the paper towel to get rid of that pigment, and I just added it back in. No big deal, very easy to fix. If you wait till it dries, it's okay too. Just re-wet it with just plain water and use the paper towel to dab it up. And it's not going to take it completely away, but it's going to lighten it enough where it's going to look just fine. I added a few spatters with the yellow and the green, and once that dried, I add a few splatters with just plain water and dab that up with a paper towel just to add a little extra interest and make it look even messier than it already does. I finished off with one of the sentiment strips from the kit and just put that directly over my image. If there's any mistakes ever, you can just cover it up. In this case, there are no mistakes because the whole thing is messy. But you do want to make sure that it is completely dry before you stick this down, or it's just not going to stick at all. But that is it for that one. Moving on to the next card. This is another super simple one that you can throw together very, very quickly. Going to use some of the pattern paper, and I'm going to use these like frame type patterns that are part of the set, and this gorgeous paper that it broke my heart to even cut it, but I wanted a little bit of it to show through on all four sides. So I'm going to make a square card with this one. I ended up taking a large stitched square die, the largest one that I have, and I just lined that up so that the flowers are showing through a little bit on all four sides. Tape that down with some Post-it note tape. That way it won't move around when I run this through my die cutting machine. And I have a Gemini. I usually don't have a problem, but I don't want to take any chances. I only have one sheet of this. So I ended up cutting another piece of the pattern paper. This is like the yellow. It's got some pattern to it, but it's yellow with a little bit of pattern to it. And I just cut this a little bit larger than my square piece just to kind of match the frame that we're going to use for the sentiment that also has this yellow around it. So I want everything to kind of match together. Like I said, super simple. I went ahead and adhered those together. Once again, I did use this glue stick. It did stick well. You just have to kind of hold it in place and it doesn't move around. So you have to, it moves around. Let me try to explain this. I'm used to wet glue, so I never line things up the right way the first time. So the wet glue allows me time to kind of slide it into place. This one doesn't really slide. You may have to pick it up and put it back down, but it is what it is, and it worked. So I'm going to cut down this frame here that matches perfectly with the pattern paper and the mat that I used. And once again, I'm going to use my mini tonic trimmer just because it's super easy. And I'm going to take one of the small sentiments from one of the stamp sets, and I'm going to stamp this down with Hot Mama ink. I did have some of that sticky stuff that is like on the edges of the paper, but I just scraped that off with my fingernail. No big deal. Stamp that down right into that white space onto my little frame here, and then adhered everything down to a white card base. I think this ended up being 5.5 inches squared, if I'm not mistaken. I'll link what I used below, so hopefully that will help. Once again, use that glue stick to adhere the main panel down to the card base, and I used some foam tape to adhere the sentiment right down in the middle. I kind of debated on what else I should do, and I mean, I could have brought in Nuvo drop sequins, whatever, but I wanted to keep with just the stuff from the kit as far as that kind of stuff goes. So I didn't. I left it as is and left it super simple. So that is it for card number 4. Moving on to the 5th and final card. I'm going to bring out some more of that pattern paper. I use this kind of repetitive pattern here, and I'm also going to take a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. This is just cardstock from my stash. This is my favorite paper to Copic color on, and I'm going to cut this. I think I cut it down a little bit. I think I cut it a 1/2 inch shorter than an A2 size, and I'm also going to cut a strip of this pattern paper. Next, I'm going to take one of the images from the one stamp set, and I'm going to stamp this down into the bottom portion of the Nina Solar White. I did stamp this twice. This is the first time I'm using the stamp, so you don't always get a great impression the first time around. So I did end up stamping this twice. Now, I am going to do some Copic coloring. Again, I'm going to stick to the colors that are in the pattern paper, which are very similar to the first card. So I'm not going to show you all of the coloring here. I will show you this mason jar here. I'm going to go right in with my darkest color, and this is a BG15, and I'm just kind of using the image as my guide. I am adding a few more shadows here and there just to add a little bit more dimension to the jar, adding a few shadows here and there, but I'm using it pretty sparingly. I'm not using this color very much. I'm going to bring in the BG11 and I'm just going to extend these areas out a little bit. Now these colors are not going to blend very well. The BGs, I have some issues with them, but I'm not looking for a perfect blend here because it's glass. It's a glass jar. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm just going to kind of soften it up a little bit, if that makes any sense. Finally, I'm going to bring in a B, I think it's a B000, and this is not a BG marker, this is just a B, but it's so light that it really doesn't make a difference. But I'm going to color in the entire thing. At first, I was just going to soften up those areas and kind of fade it to white, but I wanted a little bit of a tint to the entire thing, so I ended up just coloring in the whole thing. Now remember, the lighter the color, the more it's going to act as a colorless blender, so you don't want to go over those darkest areas too much, or else you're just going to pretty much eliminate them. Now you'll see that I colored the one flower the same way as I colored it in the first card, so I didn't bother to show you that again, but I did show you this one flower here just because I did bring in a purple combination, and just in case you're interested in the color combinations that I use, I figured I'd keep it in here. Now these petals are so tiny that I did go directly in with my darkest color, and it kind of gave me a sketchy look because I didn't have the best blend in the world, but I'm okay with that because the pattern paper that I used is kind of a sketchy look too, so it kind of sort of matches. And I'm limited on colors. A lot of my markers have dried up, so I have to use what I have right now. But I ended up using, typically I would use a V01. I couldn't find it. I know I have it. I don't know where it is. It's probably under my table somewhere. It probably rolled under something. But I tried to bring in a V20, and that was just too light. It was, like I said, acting as a colorless blender and moving my color too much. So I went just a little bit darker as my lightest color and used a V22, and that seemed to work a little bit better. Not the greatest combination, not my favorite combination I've ever used, but it was a little bit better. So I finished up coloring, and I used some warm grays for the banner and a shadow, but I forgot to press record again, so it's not a part of the video. But pretty simple. I've done it in many of the other videos that I have. So I'm using the Happy Birthday die that also comes in the kit, and I'm cutting that out from the pattern paper, but I'm also cutting this out 2 additional times from just some white scrap cardstock that I have. You can really use any color. You can use anything here. Poked out the little holes there, or the little bits, and then I'm going to glue everything together. I'm going to use my Tombow Mono Multi Glue for this one. I'm not going to use the glue stick, just because that's what I'm used to, and it gives me just a little bit more time to kind of work with this. But I'm just going to layer them up, and I kind of just start in the middle and then kind of just pinch them together so that you don't see the one underneath it, if that makes any sense. And then I'll put the pattern one right on the top. Did the same thing for the birthday, and I put those aside just to let that glue totally set. It only takes a minute or two, but I want to make sure that it is completely dry. So for the card, I am going to stamp out that same sentiment that I used on the previous card, but I'm going to kind of curve it. That's the great thing about photopolymer stamps, is that you kind of can manipulate the shape of it because I want it to fit in this banner. And I'm using an acrylic block so I can see through it, and I can kind of keep playing around with the stamp to make sure that it's the right shape. Stamp that down with my VersaFine Onyx black ink, and then I can assemble the card. I'm going to put this strip of pattern paper off to the left-hand side and the colored image right to the right-hand side, just so that I see a little bit of that pattern paper, and it will match the sentiment. I glued the sentiment towards the top, again using my Tombow Mono Multi Glue because it gives me a little bit more time to work with, and I can kind of shimmy things around if needed. Don't forget about the dot to the eye. I always seem to lose it, throw it away, throw it on the floor, or it gets stuck to the back of my hand or whatever. But you can see that I have it off to the side. I didn't bother to layer this. I just left it as is because I just didn't want to have to mess with that. But at least I didn't lose it this time. Now, if you guys have watched my channel before, you know my love for glossy accents. So, of course, I'm going to bring that in, and this is just part of my stash. And I'm going to go directly over my sentiment here just to make it a little bit more shiny. And it's going to look kind of like an embellishment rather than just a die cut. And I just used the nozzle to kind of spread things around and make sure that it is smooth. And then I also decided to add glossy accents to the strip of the patterned paper as well, because why not? Glossy accents is pretty. So I'm going to outline it first. I'm going to I'm not drawing, but I'm squeezing out a straight line where my paper meets the other paper, and then kind of go around the edges to kind of create a barrier so that it doesn't go beyond this point. It's not just going to pour out onto my work surface, and then I can fill in the gap. Now this will take some time to dry. I let it dry overnight, but you could probably give it 2 or 3 hours and you should be good to go. So here's a quick look at all 5 cards that we created today. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.